Hello everyone, welcome back to another story. Before we get started, comment below where you from and what time you are watching. And if you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. The autumn air in Knoxville carried that particular chill that comes only in early October, when summer finally surrenders to fall and the leaves begin their slow transformation from green to gold. On the campus of the University of Tennessee, students moved between buildings with their jackets pulled tight, their breath visible in small clouds as they hurried to evening classes or back to their dorms. The streetlights along Cumberland Avenue flickered on one by one as darkness settled over the city, casting long shadows across the sidewalks where groups of young people laughed and talked, their voices carrying through the cooling night air. Madison Hale sat cross-legged on the worn couch in her friend Emma's apartment, her biology textbook spread across her lap and highlighter in hand. At 19 years old, Maddie was everything a college freshman should be. Bright-eyed, optimistic, slightly overwhelmed by the workload but determined to succeed. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wore her favorite oversized University of Tennessee sweatshirt, the one her father had bought her on move-in day back in August. Around her, 3 other students were similarly absorbed in their studies. The apartment quiet, except for the occasional rustle of pages turning and the scratch of pen on paper. Maddie had always been a dedicated student, the kind of girl who color-coded her notes and started studying for exams weeks in advance. Her mother Sarah liked to joke that Maddie had been born organized, that even as a toddler she had insisted on lining up her toys in perfect rows. That discipline had served her well throughout high school in her small hometown of Maryville, just a 30-minute drive south of Knoxville. She had graduated near the top of her class, earned a scholarship to UT, and arrived on campus in August with dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse. Her parents, Sarah and David Hale, had been so proud the day they dropped her off at her dorm, even as Sarah fought back tears watching her youngest child embark on this new chapter. The study session that evening had been productive. Maddie and her friends had been working through a particularly difficult chapter on cellular respiration, quizzing each other on the complex processes that kept living things alive. As the clock on the wall ticked past 9:30, Maddie felt satisfied that she finally understood the material well enough to face the exam scheduled for later that week. She closed her textbook with a satisfied sigh and began gathering her things, stuffing notebooks and pens into her backpack, while Emma offered to make coffee to keep everyone going for another hour. Maddie declined politely, explaining that she wanted to get back to her dorm at a reasonable hour. She had an early morning shift at her part-time job at the campus library, and she still needed to shower and set out her clothes for the next day. Her friends understood, accustomed to Maddie's responsible nature and early bedtimes. They exchanged hugs and promises to meet up again before the exam, and Maddie shouldered her backpack and headed for the door. The apartment complex where Emma lived was only about 2 miles from Maddie's dorm, a quick 5-minute drive along Kingston Pike, one of Knoxville's main thoroughfares. Maddie had made the trip dozens of times since starting school, often multiple times a week for study sessions or just to hang out. The route was familiar and well lit, passing strip malls and restaurants and gas stations, all the ordinary landmarks of suburban American life. She had never felt unsafe making the drive, even at night. Knoxville was a college town, friendly and welcoming, and the areas around campus always seemed to have people around, students walking to and from parties or late-night diners. Maddie walked through the parking lot to her car, a blue Honda Civic that had been a graduation gift from her parents. It was a modest vehicle, reliable and practical, with a few dents on the back bumper from when she had accidentally backed into a pole during her first week on campus. She had been mortified, but her father had laughed it off, reminding her that everyone makes mistakes when they're learning to navigate new spaces. The car had served her well since then, never giving her any trouble, always starting on the first try. She unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, tossing her backpack onto the passenger side and adjusting her mirrors out of habit. The car's interior still smelled faintly of the vanilla air freshener her mother had hung from the rearview mirror, a small touch of home that Maddie appreciated on long days when she felt homesick. She started the engine, which turned over smoothly, and connected her phone to the car's Bluetooth system. A playlist of her favorite songs began to play softly through the speakers, a mix of pop and country music that she had curated over the summer. Before putting the car in reverse, Maddie pulled out her phone and typed a quick message to her mother. Sarah had always been a worrier, the kind of mother who liked to know that her children were safe, especially at night. Maddie understood this protective instinct and never minded sending these little check-in texts. Her fingers moved quickly across the screen as she typed, "I'm almost home, love you." She hit send at exactly 9:47 p.m., not knowing that this simple message would become the last communication her family would receive from her for 9 agonizing days. The message delivered instantly, appearing on Sarah's phone screen where she sat in her living room back in Maryville, watching television with her husband, David. Sarah smiled when she saw Maddie's text, feeling that familiar sense of relief that came from knowing her daughter was safe and heading back to her dorm. She typed back a quick heart emoji and a reminder to get enough sleep, then returned her attention to the television show, completely unaware that anything was wrong. How could she have known? There was nothing in Maddie's message to suggest danger, nothing to indicate that the next 9 days would become every parent's worst nightmare. Maddie backed out of her parking space and headed toward the exit of the apartment complex. The streets were moderately busy for a Sunday night, with cars flowing steadily along Kingston Pike in both directions. She merged into traffic smoothly, heading east toward campus. The radio played a song she recognized, and she hummed along absently, her mind already moving ahead to the tasks she needed to complete before bed. She needed to finish reading a chapter for her English class, and she wanted to call her older brother who was stationed overseas with the military. There was always so much to do, so many responsibilities to juggle, but Maddie thrived on structure and routine. The drive should have been unremarkable. Kingston Pike was a wide, well-maintained road with multiple lanes in each direction, lined with shopping centers and chain restaurants. At this time of night, traffic was lighter than during rush hour, but still steady enough that Maddie never felt alone on the road. Streetlights illuminated the pavement at regular intervals, and the businesses she passed were mostly still open, their signs glowing in the darkness. Everything was ordinary, familiar, safe. But somewhere along that 2-mile stretch of road, something went terribly wrong. The exact moment when Maddie's normal evening transformed into a living nightmare remains unclear, lost in the gap between her text message at 9:47 and the discovery of her abandoned car the following morning. What investigators would later piece together suggests that someone had been watching her, following her, waiting for the right moment to strike. In those few minutes along Kingston Pike, Maddie's life changed forever. When Maddie failed to return to her dorm that night, her roommate Jessica initially wasn't concerned. Maddie sometimes stayed later at study sessions than she planned, or stopped for a quick bite to eat on the way home. Jessica went to bed around 11, assuming Maddie would be back before morning. It wasn't until Jessica woke up at 6 a.m. and saw that Maddie's bed was still empty, still perfectly made from that morning, that worry began to creep in. She checked her phone, but there were no messages from Maddie explaining where she was. She tried calling, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Jessica's concern grew as she got ready for her own early class. It was completely unlike Maddie to stay out all night without telling anyone, to miss her morning library shift, to not respond to calls and texts. By 7 a.m., Jessica was frightened enough to contact Emma, asking if Maddie had perhaps fallen asleep at her apartment and forgotten to text. Emma confirmed that Maddie had left around 9:30 the previous evening, heading back to campus. The two friends exchanged increasingly worried messages, trying to think of logical explanations but coming up empty. At 7:30 a.m., Jessica made the call that every parent dreads receiving. Sarah Hale was getting ready for work, moving through her morning routine in the quiet house she and David had lived in for 20 years, when her phone rang. She almost didn't answer, seeing an unfamiliar number, but something made her pick up. Jessica's voice was shaky as she explained the situation, apologizing for worrying Sarah but needing to know if Maddie had perhaps come home to Maryville for some reason. Sarah felt her stomach drop, that immediate maternal instinct that something was wrong flooding through her body like ice water. Sarah tried to remain calm as she questioned Jessica about the previous night, learning about the study session, about Maddie's decision to drive back to her dorm, about the text message that Sarah herself had received. She hung up with Jessica and immediately tried calling Maddie's phone, her hands shaking as she held the device to her ear. The call went to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. Each unanswered call ratcheted up Sarah's panic another notch until she was nearly hyperventilating, her worst fears taking shape in her mind. David came running when he heard his wife's distressed cries. Sarah could barely get the words out, explaining between sobs that something had happened to Maddie, that she had left her friend's apartment to drive home and never arrived, that no one could reach her, that her phone was going to voicemail. David, a former firefighter who had seen his share of emergencies and trained himself to stay calm in crisis situations, immediately took charge. He called the Knoxville Police Department while Sarah continued trying to reach their daughter, each failed call adding another layer of terror to the morning. The initial response from the police was frustratingly cautious. Maddie was 19 years old, a legal adult, and had been missing for less than 12 hours. The officer who took David's call explained gently that most missing person cases involving college students resolved themselves quickly, that young people sometimes made impulsive decisions to stay with friends or significant others without telling their parents. David understood the reasoning, but knew in his gut that this wasn't that kind of situation. Maddie was responsible, reliable, the last person who would disappear without telling anyone. He pushed back, explaining his daughter's character, the concerning circumstances, the uncharacteristic silence. Something in David's voice must have convinced the officer that this case deserved immediate attention, because within an hour, a patrol car was dispatched to check the route between Emma's apartment and Maddie's dorm. The officer drove slowly along Kingston Pike, scanning the shoulders and parking lots for any sign of a blue Honda Civic. The morning rush hour traffic was building, cars streaming past in both directions as Knoxville woke up and headed to work. The officer almost missed it, nearly drove right past the car sitting on the shoulder of the road, partially hidden behind a large commercial sign. The blue Honda was parked at an angle on the shoulder of Kingston Pike, about halfway between Emma's apartment and campus. The officer pulled up behind it, activating his emergency lights as he approached the vehicle on foot. His heart rate increased as he got closer, his training and experience telling him that an abandoned car on the side of the road rarely meant good news. He peered through the driver's side window, his hand resting on his service weapon out of habit, and saw that the car was empty. The keys were still in the ignition. Maddie's purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet visible inside. Her phone was nowhere to be seen. The officer radioed in his discovery, and within minutes, Kingston Pike became a crime scene. More patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing in the gray morning light. Traffic slowed to a crawl as drivers craned their necks to see what was happening, wondering if there had been an accident. A supervisor arrived to assess the situation, followed shortly by detectives from the Criminal Investigations Division. The car was photographed from every angle, its location carefully documented. The doors were locked, showing no signs of forced entry. The driver's side door was closed properly, not left ajar. There was no visible damage to the vehicle, no evidence of a collision or mechanical failure. When David and Sarah Hale arrived at the scene an hour later, having made the frantic drive from Maryville, Sarah's legs nearly gave out when she saw her daughter's car sitting on the shoulder surrounded by police vehicles. David caught her, holding her upright as they approached the officer in charge. The detective, a middle-aged man named Marcus Thompson, who had 2 daughters of his own, spoke to them with a combination of professionalism and genuine compassion. He explained what they had found so far, which amounted to very little. The car appeared to have been simply parked and abandoned. There were no signs of a struggle inside or around the vehicle. Maddie's belongings were still present, except for her phone. Sarah broke down when Detective Thompson asked if she could look inside the car to see if anything was missing. She pressed her face against the window, her hands shaking as she stared at her daughter's backpack, the vanilla air freshener still hanging from the mirror, the coffee mug and the cup holder that Maddie used every morning. Everything looked normal, perfectly ordinary, as if Maddie had just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. But Maddie wasn't there. And Sarah knew with a mother's terrible certainty that something awful had happened. The hours that followed were a blur of questions and procedures. Sarah and David gave statements to the police, providing detailed descriptions of Maddie, sharing recent photos from their phones, answering questions about their daughter's habits and relationships and mental state. Did Maddie have a boyfriend? No. She had been single since starting college, focused on her studies. Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might want to hurt her? Absolutely not. Everyone who knew Maddie loved her. Was she depressed or suicidal? Never. She was happy and excited about her future. Could she have run away voluntarily? Impossible. Maddie would never do that to her family. Detective Thompson listened carefully, taking notes, asking follow-up questions. He had handled dozens of missing person cases over his career, and he had learned to read parents, to distinguish between denial and genuine knowledge of their child's character. Everything the Hales told him about Maddie painted the picture of a responsible, well-adjusted young woman with no apparent reason to disappear. The circumstances were troubling. The abandoned car, the missing phone, the sudden silence from a girl who regularly communicated with her family. Thompson's instincts told him this wasn't a case of a college student making poor choices. This was something more sinister. By mid-afternoon, Maddie's disappearance had been officially classified as an endangered missing person case, a designation that allowed law enforcement to pursue the investigation more aggressively without waiting the traditional 48 hours. News of the missing college student spread quickly through Knoxville, first via social media as Maddie's friends began posting on Facebook and Twitter, then through local news stations that picked up the story for their evening broadcasts. The University of Tennessee sent out a campus-wide alert, urging students to be cautious and to report any information about Maddie's whereabouts. The response from the community was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours of the first news reports, volunteers began gathering at a hastily organized command center set up in a church near campus. Students, faculty, local residents, and complete strangers showed up wanting to help, asking what they could do, offering their time and energy to bring Maddie home. Sarah and David stood at the front of the church, surrounded by concerned faces, trying to maintain their composure as they thanked everyone for coming. David, drawing on his firefighter training and experience with coordinating emergency responses, began organizing the volunteers into search teams. Maps of Knoxville were spread across tables, divided into grid sections. David assigned teams to different areas, focusing first on the vicinity around where Maddie's car had been found, then expanding outward in concentric circles. He gave clear instructions. Look for anything unusual, any sign that someone had been there recently, any piece of clothing or personal item that might belong to Maddie. Stay in groups for safety. Mark off areas as they were searched. Report back every hour. The volunteers listened intently, their faces grave with the seriousness of the task, then headed out into the cooling autumn afternoon. Search teams combed through the wooded areas adjacent to Kingston Pike, pushing through underbrush and calling Maddie's name. They checked dumpsters behind shopping centers, as much as it pained Sarah to think that might be necessary. They questioned employees at gas stations and restaurants along the route, showing them Maddie's photo, asking if anyone had seen her the previous night. They knocked on doors in residential neighborhoods, spreading awareness and gathering information. The search continued as daylight faded, volunteers returning to the command center with dirt on their clothes and exhaustion in their eyes. But no news of Maddie. That first night was agony for the Hale family. Sarah and David checked into a hotel near campus, unable to face the 30-minute drive back to Maryville, needing to be close to the search efforts and the police investigation. They lay awake in the darkness, holding hands across the space between the beds, each lost in their own terrible thoughts about where their daughter might be and what might be happening to her. Sarah kept replaying the last text message in her mind, those simple words. "I'm almost home. Love you." She had looked at that message 100 times already, as if staring at it might reveal some hidden clue about what had happened next. The second day brought more of the same. Searches that turned up nothing, interviews that led nowhere, a growing media presence as news vans parked outside the church command center, and reporters requested statements from the family. Sarah did a tearful interview with a local news station, pleading directly into the camera for anyone with information to come forward, for whoever had Maddie to please let her come home. Her voice cracked as she described her daughter. Kind, smart, hard-working, loved by everyone who knew her, a girl with her whole life ahead of her. David stood beside his wife, his arm around her shoulders, his jaw clenched as he fought to maintain control of his emotions. The University of Tennessee campus took on a somber atmosphere as Maddie's disappearance dominated conversations. Students who had never met her wore blue ribbons in solidarity, the color chosen because blue had been Maddie's favorite. The campus lawn became a gathering place for vigils, students sitting in circles with candles as darkness fell, singing songs and sharing prayers for Maddie's safe return. Her professors spoke about her in classes, describing her dedication and potential, refusing to use past tense, because that would mean giving up hope. The library where she worked hung her photo near the entrance, along with a message. "We're waiting for you, Maddie. Come home soon." Detective Thompson and his team worked around the clock, following every lead no matter how small. They pulled surveillance footage from businesses along Kingston Pike, spending hours reviewing grainy videos of traffic passing by, looking for Maddie's blue Honda and trying to establish a timeline. They interviewed Emma and the other students who had been at the study session, pressing them for any detail that might be relevant. Had Maddie mentioned anyone following her? Had she seemed nervous or preoccupied? Had anyone shown unusual interest in her recently? The answers were consistently no. Maddie had seemed completely normal that evening, focused on studying, relaxed, and happy. The investigation examined Maddie's phone records, though the phone itself remained missing. The data showed the last activity at 9:47 p.m. when she sent the text to her mother. After that, nothing. The phone had either been turned off or destroyed, its signal vanishing completely. There were no suspicious calls or texts in the days leading up to her disappearance, no patterns that suggested she had been in contact with anyone dangerous. Her social media accounts showed a typical college student's life: photos with friends, complaints about difficult exams, shared memes and music videos. Nothing helpful, nothing that explained why she had vanished. By the third day, the case had gained regional attention, with news outlets across Tennessee covering the story of the missing college freshman. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added Maddie to their database. The FBI field office in Knoxville reached out to offer assistance, though jurisdiction remained with local law enforcement for now. Sarah and David did more interviews, their faces appearing on television screens across the state, their anguish visible as they begged for their daughter's return. The reward for information leading to finding Maddie grew as local businesses and concerned citizens contributed, reaching $25,000 by the end of the week. The search efforts continued, but began to shift focus as the immediate area around Kingston Pike yielded nothing. David worked with police to expand the search radius, organizing teams to check more remote locations outside the city. Volunteers walked through parks and nature reserves, searched abandoned buildings and empty lots, followed hiking trails into the hills surrounding Knoxville. The physical toll of these searches was evident. Blistered feet, scratched arms from pushing through thorny bushes, voices hoarse from calling Maddie's name for hours. But no one complained. Everyone understood the stakes, understood that every moment mattered. Detective Thompson's investigation took a darker turn as he began seriously considering the possibility of abduction. The circumstances pointed increasingly toward someone having taken Maddie against her will. The lack of evidence at the car suggested whoever was responsible had been careful, organized, possibly experienced. Thompson requested additional resources from the department, bringing in officers with specialized training in crimes against persons. They began developing profiles of potential suspects, looking at known offenders in the area, checking into recent releases from jail or prison who might match the circumstances. Sarah spent her days at the command center, coordinating with volunteers, accepting hugs from strangers, listening to people share their own stories of missing loved ones and recovered children. She found a strange comfort in staying busy, in feeling like she was doing something productive rather than simply sitting and waiting. But the nights were unbearable, long stretches of darkness where her mind conjured terrible scenarios about what might be happening to Maddie. Was she hurt? Was she scared? Was she calling out for her mother? Was she still alive? That last question was the one Sarah could barely allow herself to think, but it lurked at the edges of every moment. David dealt with his anguish differently, channeling his fear and helplessness into action. He barely slept, subsisting on coffee and adrenaline as he drove search teams to new locations, marked off completed areas on his maps, made lists of places still to check. His firefighter training had prepared him for crisis management, for staying focused under pressure, for not allowing emotions to paralyze action. But this was different than any emergency he had faced in his career. This was his daughter, his baby girl, missing and possibly in danger. And all his training couldn't protect him from the crushing weight of not knowing where she was. On the fifth day, a tip came in that briefly raised hopes. A clerk at a gas station 15 miles outside Knoxville reported seeing a girl matching Maddie's description getting out of a dark-colored pickup truck late at night, looking distressed. Police rushed to investigate, bringing Sarah and David along to see if the clerk could confirm the identification from additional photos. But after reviewing security footage from the gas station, it became clear the girl was not Maddie. She was similar in appearance but older, and she had been with her boyfriend after an argument. The lead evaporated, leaving the Hales to return to their hotel room with another disappointment added to the growing pile. More false leads followed over the next few days. Someone called claiming to have seen Maddie at a rest stop in Virginia. Another caller reported a young woman matching her description at a bus station in Georgia. Each tip required investigation. Each one raised and then dashed hopes. Detective Thompson followed up on every single report, no matter how unlikely, because he knew from experience that sometimes the truth came from unexpected places. But as the days accumulated with no real progress, even Thompson began to worry that this case might remain unsolved, that Maddie might become another statistic, another missing person who was never found. The campus vigils grew larger as the first week without Maddie drew to a close. Hundreds of students gathered on the lawn outside the student center, holding candles that flickered in the October darkness. They sang Maddie's favorite songs, shared memories of interactions with her, promised each other they wouldn't give up hope. Sarah and David attended these vigils, drawing strength from the outpouring of support even as their own reserves of hope began to run dangerously low. It had been 7 days since Maddie sent that text message, 7 days of fear and uncertainty, and increasingly desperate prayers. On the 8th day, something changed. A lead came in that initially seemed as insignificant as all the others, but would prove to be the break the investigation desperately needed. A retired bus driver named Henry Morrison called the police tip line to report something he had noticed while reviewing dashcam footage from his route. Morrison had been driving his usual nightly circuit through Knoxville on October 9th, the same night Maddie disappeared, and his bus had been equipped with a forward-facing camera that recorded continuously. He had been following the case on the news and decided to check his footage from that night, just in case he had captured something relevant. What Morrison saw on his footage made his pulse quicken. At approximately 9:53 p.m., his bus had been traveling along Kingston Pike, heading east in the same direction Maddie would have been driving. The dashcam showed the road ahead, other vehicles visible in the frame as they passed under streetlights. Morrison watched his own footage carefully, and there, for just a few seconds, he saw something that police had missed in their review of other surveillance: a blue Honda Civic in the right lane, and behind it, following at a close distance, a motorcycle. The bike was dark-colored, possibly black, with no visible license plate in the grainy nighttime footage. Morrison called it in immediately, and within an hour, Detective Thompson was sitting in the retired bus driver's living room, watching the footage on a laptop. Thompson felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with discovering a real lead. He watched the clip multiple times, zooming in as far as the resolution would allow. The Honda was definitely similar to Maddie's car, and the timestamp matched the window when she would have been making her drive. The motorcycle following it was harder to make out in detail, but its presence was clear. More importantly, the way it was following close enough to be intentional, but not close enough to be obvious, suggested this wasn't just random traffic. The police technical unit enhanced the footage as much as possible, cleaning up the image and adjusting brightness and contrast. The motorcycle remained frustratingly unclear, but they were able to determine some details. It appeared to be a cruiser-style bike, probably a Harley-Davidson or similar make based on the silhouette. The rider wore dark clothing and a helmet, making identification impossible. But the bike itself had distinctive features: custom exhaust pipes that were visible even in the low-quality video, and what appeared to be a matte finish rather than glossy paint. These details might not seem like much, but to investigators, they were gold. Detective Thompson immediately began cross-referencing databases of motorcycle registrations in the Knoxville area, specifically looking for matte black Harley-Davidsons or similar cruiser bikes. The list was longer than he hoped, but manageable, containing about 40 registered owners within a 20-mile radius of where Maddie had disappeared. Thompson assigned officers to begin checking out each owner, looking for anyone with a criminal history, anyone who might fit the profile of someone who would abduct a young woman. It was tedious work, knocking on doors, asking to see motorcycles, running background checks, but it was the most promising direction the investigation had taken. The task force working Maddie's case divided the list of motorcycle owners among several teams and began making visits. Most of the owners were quickly cleared: older men with no criminal history, Weekend riders who had been out of town the night Maddie disappeared, people whose bikes didn't match the description despite similar registration information. But on the afternoon of the 8th day, one of the teams hit a significant lead. They visited an address in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts of Knoxville, looking for the owner of a matte black Harley registered under that address. No one answered the door, but neighbors said the bike belonged to a man named Travis Coleman, a mechanic who lived alone and kept odd hours. A background check on Travis Coleman revealed a concerning history. He was 32 years old, had served 3 years in prison for assault of a woman he had been dating, and had been released just 8 months ago. Since his release, he had been working at an auto repair shop and living in the rental house where police had just knocked on his door. More concerning, Coleman had a motorcycle endorsement on his license, and photos from his social media accounts showed him with a matte black Harley that closely matched the description from the enhanced bus footage. He also had a prior arrest for stalking, though those charges had been dropped when the victim moved out of state. Detective Thompson felt his instincts screaming that this was their man. Everything fit: the motorcycle, the criminal history, the proximity to where Maddie had vanished. But instincts weren't enough for a warrant, especially without any physical evidence linking Coleman to Maddie. Thompson needed more, needed something concrete that would justify a search of Coleman's property. He ordered surveillance on Coleman's house, putting unmarked cars in the area to watch for any suspicious activity. He also began digging deeper into Coleman's recent movements, checking his employment records, talking to his boss at the repair shop, looking for any connection to Maddie. The surveillance teams watched Coleman's house through the night and into the 9th day. Coleman came and went on his motorcycle, seemingly unaware he was being observed. He went to work, came home, ordered pizza delivery. Nothing about his behavior appeared overtly suspicious, but that meant little. Thompson knew that criminals often maintained normal routines, even while hiding terrible secrets. The challenge was finding those secrets before it was too late, before evidence could be destroyed or moved, before a victim could be harmed further or killed. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the detectives talking to Coleman's former associates discovered that Coleman had previously rented a storage garage on the outskirts of the city, in an area that was semi-rural and relatively isolated. The informant, a former co-worker who disliked Coleman and found him creepy, mentioned that Coleman had kept the garage even after moving to his current house, using it to work on motorcycles and store parts. More interestingly, the co-worker said he had stopped by the garage a few months ago, and Coleman had been strangely defensive, not allowing him inside and becoming agitated when asked about it. This information was exactly what Thompson needed. He immediately obtained Coleman's rental records and identified the storage garage, a standalone structure on a piece of property outside the city limits, surrounded by trees and accessible by a gravel road. The property owner confirmed that Coleman still rented the space on a month-to-month basis and paid in cash. With this information and Coleman's criminal history, Thompson was able to secure a search warrant for both Coleman's house and the storage garage. The decision was made to execute both warrants simultaneously to prevent Coleman from destroying evidence or fleeing if he became aware of police activity at one location. The raids were planned for early morning on Day 9, October 18th. Thompson assembled a tactical team for each location, briefing them carefully on the situation. There was urgency now, a sense that time was running out. Maddie had been missing for 9 days, and statistics were not on her side. The longer someone remained missing, the less likely they were to be found alive. But Thompson allowed himself a small measure of hope. If Coleman had Maddie, if he had taken her to that storage garage, there was a chance she was still alive, still waiting to be rescued. That hope motivated every officer involved in the operation. At 5:30 a.m., both teams moved simultaneously. One group descended on Coleman's house, pounding on the door and announcing their presence. Coleman answered in his underwear, surprised and angry, but he was quickly handcuffed and detained while officers swept through the small house. They found some concerning items: duct tape, rope, zip ties, but nothing definitively connecting him to Maddie. His computer was seized for forensic analysis. His motorcycle was impounded. Coleman himself said nothing, invoking his right to an attorney immediately. The second team, led by Detective Thompson himself, approached the storage garage with greater caution and greater hope. The structure was indeed isolated, sitting in a clearing surrounded by dense woods, invisible from the nearest road. There were no windows, just a large rolling door and a smaller side entrance. Thompson's heart pounded as he approached the side door, knowing that what they found in the next few moments could make or break this case, could mean life or death for Maddie Hale. He tried the door handle and found it locked, then gave the signal for the tactical team to breach the door with a battering ram. The door crashed inward, and officers poured into the dark interior, their flashlights cutting through the dimness, voices shouting, "Police! Search warrant!" The garage was cluttered with motorcycle parts, tools hanging on the walls, workbenches covered with greasy equipment. It appeared at first glance to be nothing more than what it was supposed to be, a workspace for vehicle repairs. But then, in the back corner of the garage, behind a tarp hanging from the ceiling, an officer spotted another door, this one newer and reinforced, completely out of place in the shabby structure. Thompson approached the second door, his pulse racing. This had to be it. He tried the handle and found this one locked as well, secured with a heavy padlock. Bolt cutters made quick work of the lock, and Thompson pulled the door open, shining his flashlight into what appeared to be a makeshift room that had been constructed within the larger garage. The space was small, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and a concrete floor. There was a mattress in the corner, a bucket, some bottles of water. And there, curled up on the mattress, dirty and terrified but unmistakably alive, was Madison Hale. Maddie blinked in the harsh glare of the flashlights, raising her hand to shield her eyes, her body trembling. For a moment, she seemed unable to process what was happening, unable to believe that the door had actually opened and that these were police officers, and that her nightmare might finally be ending. Thompson holstered his weapon and moved forward slowly, speaking gently, identifying himself, telling Maddie that she was safe now, that they were going to get her out of there and take her to her parents. At those words, her parents, Maddie broke down completely, sobbing with relief and exhaustion, and the release of 9 days of terror. The officers moved quickly to assess Maddie's condition. She appeared physically unharmed, aside from being dehydrated and malnourished. There were no visible signs of sexual assault, no serious injuries. She was cold, the temperature in the concrete room was barely above freezing, and she was emotionally traumatized. But she was alive. Paramedics were called to the scene, and Maddie was wrapped in blankets and given water while they waited. Thompson stayed with her, asking gentle questions about what had happened, but Maddie was too overwhelmed to provide coherent answers yet. There would be time for detailed statements later. Right now, the priority was getting her medical care and reuniting her with her family. The call to Sarah and David Hale came at 6:15 a.m. Detective Thompson's voice was thick with emotion as he delivered the news every parent prays to hear. "We found her. She's alive. She's okay." Sarah collapsed, her legs giving out completely as relief crashed over her like a physical force. David caught her, both of them crying, unable to speak, barely able to breathe. Thompson told them Maddie was being taken to the University of Tennessee Medical Center for evaluation, and that they should meet her there. The Hales were in their car within minutes, Sarah calling Maddie's brother and other family members as David drove, breaking speed limits in their desperate rush to see their daughter. At the hospital, Maddie was taken to a private room where doctors examined her thoroughly. Beyond dehydration, malnutrition, and minor cuts and bruises, she was in remarkably good physical condition, considering her ordeal. The psychological trauma would take much longer to assess and treat, but for now, the immediate concern was her physical well-being. Maddie was given fluids intravenously, warm blankets, soft clothes to replace the dirty jeans and sweatshirt she had been wearing for 9 days. A counselor specially trained in trauma sat with her, speaking quietly, helping her feel safe. When Sarah and David burst into the hospital room, the reunion was everything the word suggests. Laughter and tears and desperate hugs, Sarah holding Maddie's face in her hands as if needing to confirm she was real. David wrapping both his wife and daughter in his arms, all three of them crying too hard to speak. The medical staff gave them privacy, closing the door and posting an officer outside to keep media and curious onlookers away. For those first precious minutes, nothing else mattered except that their family was whole again, that Maddie was back with them, that the nightmare was over. As the hours passed and Maddie became more comfortable and secure, she was able to begin telling her story to Detective Thompson and a specially trained interviewer. What emerged was a harrowing account of the night she was taken and the 9 days that followed. Maddie had been driving home along Kingston Pike, exactly as she had done dozens of times before, when she noticed a motorcycle following her closely. At first, she thought nothing of it. There were always motorcycles on the road, but then the bike had accelerated and pulled alongside her car, the rider gesturing for her to pull over. Maddie had initially ignored the gestures, assuming the rider was mistaken or confused, but then he had begun to edge closer to her car, dangerously close, forcing her toward the shoulder. Maddie, frightened and unsure what to do, had pulled over to avoid a collision. The moment her car stopped, the rider later confirmed to be Travis Coleman had jumped off his bike and rushed to her driver's side door. He had pulled the door open before Maddie could lock it, grabbing her arm and pulling her from the vehicle. In the confusion and terror of that moment, Maddie had dropped her phone, which Coleman immediately stomped on, destroying it. Coleman had a knife, which he showed to Maddie while hissing threats about what would happen if she screamed or tried to run. He forced her onto his motorcycle, making her sit in front of him where he could control her movements, and then drove away from her abandoned car. Maddie remembered passing other vehicles on the road, wanting desperately to signal for help, but terrified of what Coleman might do if she tried. The ride had lasted maybe 20 minutes, though Maddie had been too frightened and disoriented to track time or direction accurately. When they arrived at the storage garage, Coleman had dragged Maddie inside and into the makeshift room he had prepared. The room had clearly been set up in advance, suggesting premeditation, though whether Coleman had specifically targeted Maddie or had simply been waiting for an opportunity with any victim remained unclear. He had bound her wrists with zip ties and left her in the dark room, telling her that if she cooperated and stayed quiet, he wouldn't hurt her. Then he had left, locking both doors behind him. The 9 days that followed existed in a strange temporal limbo for Maddie. Coleman visited the room periodically, bringing food and water, sometimes staying to talk at her, sharing paranoid delusions about society and women and his own grievances against the world. Maddie, drawing on reserves of courage and intelligence she hadn't known she possessed, had carefully managed these interactions, responding in ways that seemed to calm Coleman rather than agitate him. She had asked him about his motorcycle, about his work, about his life, anything to humanize herself to him and reduce the risk that he would harm her. This strategy, which Maddie had employed instinctively rather than through any formal training, had likely saved her life. Hostage negotiation experts would later confirm that Maddie's approach of engaging Coleman in conversation, showing interest in his perspective, and avoiding confrontation had been exactly the right thing to do. She had read Coleman's instability and narcissism, and had fed his need for attention and validation rather than challenging him. It was an exhausting performance, maintaining this careful balance while terrified and imprisoned, but it had kept her alive long enough for police to find her. Coleman had never sexually assaulted Maddie, something investigators found notable. His previous crimes had involved violence and control rather than sexual motivation, and that pattern had apparently continued. He seemed to want someone to talk to, someone to validate his worldview, someone he could control completely. Maddie had been that person for 9 days, playing a role that had required every ounce of her strength and intelligence. The psychological toll of this performance would become clear in the weeks and months ahead, but in the moment, it had been survival. Travis Coleman was arrested at his house the same morning Maddie was rescued. With Maddie's identification and the evidence found at the storage garage, charges were filed immediately: kidnapping, aggravated assault, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple other counts. The district attorney's office announced they would seek the maximum penalty under Tennessee law, ensuring Coleman would spend decades in prison if convicted. Coleman's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but prosecutors refused, confident in their case and determined to hold Coleman accountable for the terror he had inflicted. The media attention that had surrounded Maddie's disappearance exploded into something even larger with news of her rescue. The story had everything that captures public attention: a young, promising student, a dramatic abduction, a tense investigation, and ultimately, a successful rescue. News outlets across the country covered the story, showing footage of the storage garage being processed as a crime scene, interviewing volunteers who had searched for Maddie, airing clips from Sarah and David's emotional press conference, thanking everyone who had helped bring their daughter home. The phrase, "I'm almost home," became a symbol of the case, representing both the tragic interruption of a normal evening and the ultimate return to safety. Maddie spent 3 days in the hospital recovering physically and beginning to process her trauma. Counselors visited daily, and a therapist who specialized in kidnapping victims began working with her to develop coping strategies for the difficult road ahead. Sarah never left Maddie's side, sleeping in a chair next to her daughter's bed, waking at the slightest sound to make sure Maddie was okay. David shuttled back and forth between the hospital and home, handling the practical matters that still needed attention, while unable to be away from his family for long. When Maddie was finally discharged from the hospital, the question of what came next loomed large. Would she return to school? Would she go home to Maryville? What would her life look like now, after this trauma? Maddie herself wasn't sure of the answers, feeling simultaneously desperate for normalcy and terrified of the world outside. The therapist encouraged her to move slowly, to not make major decisions immediately, to focus on healing and safety first. Sarah and David supported whatever Maddie wanted, whether that meant taking a semester off, or returning to campus, or something else entirely. The University of Tennessee community had remained engaged throughout Maddie's disappearance, and now they rallied around her return. The university offered her whatever accommodations she needed: extensions on assignments, the option to attend classes remotely, access to counseling services, anything that would help her continue her education if she chose to. Her professors reached out individually, expressing their relief at her safe return and their willingness to work with her. Her friends, especially Emma and Jessica, visited carefully at first, unsure how to act around someone who had been through such an ordeal, but gradually settling back into more natural patterns of interaction. Maddie made the decision, surprising some, to return to school for the spring semester. She took the remainder of the fall semester off, using that time to work intensively with her therapist and to gradually rebuild her sense of security and autonomy. She moved back home to Maryville for those months, sleeping in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by familiar comforts and the constant presence of her family. She took long walks with her mother, worked on jigsaw puzzles with her father, video called with her brother who was still stationed overseas. These simple activities became part of her healing process, rebuilding her sense of normalcy one day at a time. The trial of Travis Coleman began in the spring and concluded within a week. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Maddie's testimony, the enhanced dashcam footage, the prepared room at the storage garage, Coleman's own statements to police before he lawyered up. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Coleman was sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence given his age. Sarah and David attended every day of the trial, wanting to see justice served, while Maddie attended only for her testimony, not wanting to spend more time in Coleman's presence than absolutely necessary. When Maddie returned to campus in January, she was both the same girl who had left for a study session on October 9th and someone completely different. She still loved learning, still wanted to be a pediatric nurse, still made color-coded notes and studied weeks in advance for exams. But she also carried the weight of her experience, the knowledge of how quickly safety can evaporate, how thin the line is between normal life and nightmare. She attended therapy sessions twice a week, worked with a support group for crime victims, took self-defense classes, and gradually rebuilt her confidence in moving through the world. The phrase, "I'm almost home," took on a life beyond Maddie's case. The local community began using it as a rallying cry for campus safety initiatives, for better lighting along common routes, for increased police presence in areas where students walked alone at night. A scholarship fund was established in Maddie's name, supporting young women pursuing careers in medicine and providing grants for campus safety programs. The first recipients received their awards in a ceremony that Maddie attended, standing on stage as proof that survival was possible, that life continued even after trauma. Maddie graduated from the University of Tennessee 3.5 years later, a semester later than originally planned, but with the same honors and achievements she had always dreamed of. She was accepted into the nursing program she had applied to, and began working toward her goal of caring for sick children. At her graduation, Sarah and David stood with tears in their eyes, not just proud of their daughter's academic achievement, but in awe of her resilience, her refusal to let Travis Coleman define her story or limit her future. Maddie walked across that stage in her cap and gown, accepting her diploma, her smile genuine even as she carried scars that would never fully heal. The storage garage where Maddie had been held was eventually demolished, the property owner unable to rent the cursed location and unwilling to maintain it. The site stands empty now, nature slowly reclaiming the cleared ground where the structure once stood. Kingston Pike continues to carry traffic day and night, students making the same drive Maddie made that October evening, most of them unaware of what happened there, of the girl who almost didn't make it home. But Maddie knows. She sometimes drives that route when she visits Knoxville, not because she needs to, but because she wants to prove to herself that she can, that Coleman didn't take that freedom from her. The dashcam footage that broke the case, the bus driver's careful review of his own recordings, became a teaching case in criminal justice programs about the importance of public cooperation in investigations and the value of technology in solving crimes. Henry Morrison, the retired bus driver, was honored by the Aitzur, Knoxville Police Department for his vigilance and civic responsibility. He attended the ceremony but deflected praise, saying he had simply done what anyone should do when they saw something that might help. Detective Thompson, who had never given up on finding Maddie alive, kept a photo of her rescue on his desk for the rest of his career, a reminder that miracles sometimes happen in police work. Sarah Hale became an advocate for missing person cases, working with organizations that support families of the missing and pushing for legislation to improve the initial response when someone is reported missing. She shared her story at conferences and community meetings, always starting with those terrible 9 days and ending with Maddie's rescue, emphasizing both the despair and the hope. David continued his involvement with search and rescue operations, training volunteers in proper search techniques and coordinating responses when other families faced the nightmare his family had survived. Together, they turned their trauma into purpose, helping others navigate similar crises. The community of volunteers who had searched for Maddie during those 9 days remained connected, forming lasting friendships built on shared experience. They gathered annually on October 18th, the anniversary of Maddie's rescue, not in sadness but in celebration of her survival and in remembrance of their collective effort to bring her home. Maddie attended these gatherings when she could, thanking people who had walked through woods and knocked on doors and refused to give up hope. Their determination, combined with good detective work and a critical piece of dashcam footage, had saved her life, and she never forgot that. Maddie's phone, the one Coleman had destroyed that night on Kingston Pike, was never recovered beyond a few fragments found near where her car had been abandoned. She got a new phone with the same number, and that last text message to her mother was backed up and preserved. Sarah still has that message saved, though she rarely looks at it anymore. When she does, it no longer fills her with the agony of those 9 days, but rather with gratitude that Maddie did make it home, that those words were not the last communication they would ever have, that their story ended with rescue rather than tragedy. The psychological impact of her kidnapping stayed with Maddie, as such experiences always do. She dealt with nightmares, hypervigilance, anxiety about being alone, all the predictable symptoms of trauma. But she also found unexpected strengths, a deeper appreciation for ordinary moments, stronger relationships with family and friends, a commitment to helping others that shaped her career choice. She became a pediatric nurse specializing in trauma care, working with children who had experienced violence or abuse, using her own experience to bring empathy and understanding to her young patients. In helping them heal, she continued her own healing. When Maddie returned to campus in January, she was both the same girl who had left for a study session on October 9th and someone completely different. She still loved learning, still wanted to be a pediatric nurse, still made color-coded notes and studied weeks in advance for exams. But she also carried the weight of her experience, the knowledge of how quickly safety can evaporate, how thin the line is between normal life and nightmare. She attended therapy sessions twice a week, worked with a support group for crime victims, took self-defense classes, and gradually rebuilt her confidence in moving through the world. The phrase, "I'm almost home," took on a life beyond Maddie's case. The local community began using it as a rallying cry for campus safety initiatives, for better lighting along common routes, for increased police presence in areas where students walked alone at night. A scholarship fund was established in Maddie's name, supporting young women pursuing careers in medicine and providing grants for campus safety programs. The first recipients received their awards in a ceremony that Maddie attended, standing on stage as proof that survival was possible, that life continued even after trauma. Maddie graduated from the University of Tennessee 3.5 years later, a semester later than originally planned, but with the same honors and achievements she had always dreamed of. She was accepted into the nursing program she had applied to and began working toward her goal of caring for sick children. At her graduation, Sarah and David stood with tears in their eyes, not just proud of their daughter's academic achievement, but in awe of her resilience, her refusal to let Travis Coleman define her story or limit her future. Maddie walked across that stage in her cap and gown, accepting her diploma, her smile genuine even as she carried scars that would never fully heal. The storage garage where Maddie had been held was eventually demolished, the property owner unable to rent the cursed location and unwilling to maintain it. The site stands empty now, nature slowly reclaiming the cleared ground where the structure once stood. Kingston Pike continues to carry traffic day and night, students making the same drive Maddie made that October evening, most of them unaware of what happened there, of the girl who almost didn't make it home. But Maddie knows. She sometimes drives that route when she visits Knoxville, not because she needs to, but because she wants to prove to herself that that Coleman didn't take that freedom from her. The dashcam footage that broke the case, the bus driver's careful review of his own recordings, became a teaching case in criminal justice programs about the importance of public cooperation in investigations and the value of technology in solving crimes. Henry Morrison, the retired bus driver, was honored by the Knoxville Police Department for his vigilance and civic responsibility. He attended the ceremony but deflected praise, saying he had simply done what anyone should do when they saw something that might help. Detective Thompson, who had never given up on finding Maddie alive, kept a photo of her rescue on his desk for the rest of his career. A reminder that miracles sometimes happen in police work. Sarah Hale became an advocate for missing person cases, working with organizations that support families of the missing and pushing for legislation to improve the initial response when someone is reported missing. She shared her story at conferences and community meetings, always starting with those terrible 9 days and ending with Maddie's rescue, emphasizing both the despair and the hope. David continued his involvement with search and rescue operations, training volunteers in proper search techniques and coordinating responses when other families faced the nightmare his family had survived. Together, they turned their trauma into purpose, helping others navigate similar crises. The community of volunteers who had searched for Maddie during those 9 days remained connected, forming lasting friendships built on shared experience. They gathered annually on October 18th, the anniversary of Maddie's rescue, not in sadness but in celebration of her survival and in remembrance of their collective effort to bring her home. Maddie attended these gatherings when she could, thanking people who had walked through woods and knocked on doors and refused to give up hope. Their determination, combined with good detective work and a critical piece of dashcam footage, had saved her life. And she never forgot that. Maddie's phone, the one Coleman had destroyed that night on Kingston Pike, was never recovered beyond a few fragments found near where her car had been abandoned. She got a new phone with the same number, and that last text message to her mother was backed up and preserved. Sarah still has that message saved, though she rarely looks at it anymore. When she does, it no longer fills her with the agony of those 9 days, but rather with gratitude that Maddie did make it home, that those words were not the last communication they would ever have, that their story ended with rescue rather than tragedy. The psychological impact of her kidnapping stayed with Maddie, as such experiences always do. She dealt with nightmares, hypervigilance, anxiety about being alone, all the predictable symptoms of trauma. But she also found unexpected strengths, a deeper appreciation for ordinary moments, stronger relationships with family and friends, a commitment to helping others that shaped her career choice. She became a pediatric nurse, specializing in trauma care, working with children who had experienced violence or abuse, using her own experience to bring empathy and understanding to her young patients. In helping them heal, she continued her own healing. Travis Coleman served his sentence at a maximum security facility in Tennessee, largely forgotten by the public that had once been riveted by his crime. He became just another inmate, one of thousands, his brief moment of notoriety fading into the background noise of the criminal justice system. For Maddie, his imprisonment meant safety, the assurance that he could not harm her or anyone else again. She thought about him rarely, refusing to give him space in her mind, focusing instead on building the life he had tried to steal from her. The case of Madison Hale became part of Knoxville's collective memory, one of those stories that gets retold when discussing campus safety or remarkable rescues, or the importance of community action. New students arrive at the University of Tennessee each year, unaware of the girl who disappeared on her way home from a study session. And gradually they learn the story from older students or professors or news articles they stumble across online. The blue ribbons that symbolized the search for Maddie have been replaced by newer causes and concerns, as is natural and appropriate, but the lessons of her case endure. For the Hale family, life eventually found a new normal, one that acknowledged the trauma they had experienced but wasn't defined by it. They celebrated birthdays and holidays, welcomed Maddie's brother back from overseas deployment, attended Maddie's nursing school graduation, and eventually her wedding to a man who knew her story and loved her not despite it, but including it, understanding that trauma was part of her history, but not her identity. Sarah and David became grandparents, watching Maddie build the future that had almost been taken from her, feeling grateful for every ordinary moment they might otherwise have taken for granted. The phrase, "I'm almost home," remains significant to anyone who followed Maddie's case, those 5 simple words carrying weight they never should have had to bear. But they also came to represent something beyond the tragedy they were associated with. They became a promise that home is possible, that rescue can happen, that stories can have good endings even when they start with terror. For every family dealing with a missing loved one, for every volunteer searching through woods or reviewing footage or hanging flyers, those words offer a target to aim for: bringing someone home. The scholarship fund, established in Maddie's name, continues to support young women pursuing healthcare careers, awarding grants each year to students who demonstrate academic excellence and commitment to serving vulnerable populations. The recipients receive their awards at a ceremony each spring, and Maddie attends when her nursing shifts allow, speaking briefly about the importance of community support and the power of refusing to give up hope. She doesn't dwell on her own ordeal during these speeches, preferring to focus forward rather than backward, but her presence itself is a testimony to survival and resilience. On October 9th each year, the anniversary of her abduction, Maddie takes time to reflect on how far she has come since that night. She thinks about the 19-year-old girl who left a study session with such ordinary concerns, worried about exams and library shifts and getting enough sleep. She mourns for that girl's lost innocence, the assumption of safety that Coleman shattered. But she also honors that girl's courage, her intelligence, her will to survive, the strength she found in those 9 days that she didn't know she possessed. That girl is still part of her, even as she has grown and changed and healed. The enhanced dashcam footage that identified Coleman's motorcycle, the critical piece of evidence that broke the case, was preserved as evidence and remains in the case file stored in police archives. It's been used as a training tool, shown to new detectives as an example of how ordinary citizens can contribute to investigations and how small details can make enormous differences. Henry Morrison's decision to review his footage, to take the time to look for something that might help, changed the course of the investigation and possibly saved Maddie's life. Sometimes heroism looks like paying attention, like caring enough to take action, like checking your dashcam footage when a college student goes missing. Detective Marcus Thompson retired from the Knoxville Police Department several years after solving Maddie's case, his career marked by many successes, but none that affected him as deeply as finding her alive in that storage garage. He stayed in touch with the Hale family, receiving Christmas cards and occasional visits, maintaining a friendship that had been forged in crisis. On his retirement day, Maddie attended the ceremony, thanking him publicly for never giving up on her, for believing she could be found, for leading the team that rescued her. Thompson told her the credit belonged to many people, which was true, but Maddie knew his leadership had been essential. The blue Honda Civic that Maddie had been driving that night was eventually returned to the Hale family after being held as evidence. Maddie never wanted to drive it again, the car too connected to traumatic memories, so her parents traded it in for a different vehicle. The new car was red, a color Maddie had always liked, and it became her transportation through nursing school and into her professional life. Sometimes she missed the vanilla air freshener her mother had hung in the old Honda, that small connection to home. So Sarah bought new ones for the red car, maintaining that tradition across vehicles and years. The storage, garage location, though the structure itself had been demolished, became a place Maddie visited once, accompanied by her therapist as part of her healing process. Standing on the empty ground where she had been held, seeing it in daylight, and knowing Coleman was in prison and she was free, helped her reclaim some of the power that place had held over her nightmares. She hasn't returned since that therapeutic visit, having no need to. The location no longer haunts her dreams the way it once did, fading into memory rather than remaining an active source of fear. Maddie's story was covered in true crime podcasts and television documentaries in the years following her rescue, productions that requested her participation but respected her decision when she declined most of them. She didn't want to be defined by the worst 9 days of her life, didn't want her identity reduced to victim or survivor. She agreed to one carefully produced documentary that focused on the investigation and rescue efforts rather than sensationalizing her trauma, wanting to honor the work of police and volunteers while maintaining her privacy. The documentary raised awareness about campus safety and contributed to the scholarship fund, achieving goals Maddie valued. The University of Tennessee campus has changed in the years since Maddie's abduction, with improved lighting along common routes, enhanced security patrols, a campus-wide safety app that allows students to request escorts or quickly alert security to concerns, and regular safety workshops. These improvements can be traced directly to conversations sparked by Maddie's case, by the community's determination that such a thing should never happen again to one of their students. The changes can't guarantee safety, nothing can, but they reduce risk. They show students that their security matters, and they honor Maddie's experience by trying to prevent others from sharing it. Sarah Hale's advocacy work for families of missing persons has helped numerous other families navigate the terror of having a loved one disappear. She offers practical advice about working with police, organizing search efforts, managing media attention, and maintaining hope during the unbearable waiting. But more than advice, she offers understanding, the validation that comes from talking to someone who has lived through similar anguish. Some of the families she helps receive the same miracle the Hales did, their loved ones found alive. Others aren't as fortunate, and Sarah grieves with them, honoring their loss while grateful for her own outcome. David Hale's work with search and rescue volunteers has made practical differences in multiple cases, his organizational skills and calm leadership helping to coordinate effective searches even in chaotic circumstances. He teaches volunteers about grid patterns and proper evidence handling and communication protocols, all lessons learned during the desperate search for Maddie. He tells searchers that their work matters, that every area checked is one less place to worry about, that persistence and attention to detail save lives. He knows this personally, having lived through both sides of the equation. The recovery of Maddie Hale became a case study in multiple fields. Criminal justice courses examined the investigation techniques, psychology programs studied her survival strategies, journalism classes analyzed the media coverage, and social work programs looked at community response and support systems. Her experience, while uniquely hers, offered insights relevant to many disciplines. Maddie gave permission for her case to be studied and discussed in academic settings, wanting something constructive to come from her trauma, wanting future professionals to learn from what she endured. Travis Coleman's appeals of his conviction were all denied, The evidence against him too strong, the legal procedures followed too carefully to provide grounds for reversal. He will likely die in prison, having thrown away whatever potential his life might have held in exchange for the temporary power he felt in controlling and terrifying a young woman. His story serves as a warning about how untreated mental illness combined with violent tendencies and sense of entitlement can destroy lives, both his victims and his own. There is no redemption in his tale, only the justice of his imprisonment. The lasting legacy of Maddie's case isn't found in any single element, not the dramatic rescue, not the criminal conviction, not the media coverage, but in the thousands of small ways it changed lives and perspectives. Volunteers who searched for her became more engaged in their communities. Students became more aware of their surroundings. Parents held their children a little tighter. Police improved their response protocols. And everyone who followed the story was reminded that ordinary evenings can turn extraordinary in heartbeats, that vigilance matters, that community action saves lives, and that hope should never be abandoned even in the darkest hours. Madison Hale is 30 years old now as this account is written, more than a decade removed from that October night that almost ended her life. She works as a pediatric trauma nurse, helps with her family's missing person advocacy work when time allows, maintains close relationships with her family and friends, and lives a life that is both ordinary and precious. She still texts her mother regularly, still often ends messages with, "Love you," though neither of them take those communications for granted anymore. Every text received is a small gift, a reminder that connection continues, that home is reachable, that the promise implied in "I'm almost home" can be fulfilled. The story of Madison Hale, her abduction, her survival, her rescue, and her recovery stands as testimony to human resilience and communal strength. It demonstrates that evil exists but can be overcome, that terror is real but need not be permanent, that trauma shapes us but doesn't have to define us, and that the simple act of refusing to give up hope can make the difference between tragedy and miracle. Her last text before disappearing said she was almost home, and though the journey took 9 terrifying days longer than anyone anticipated, Madison Hale did finally make it home, and she has been building her life from that foundation of survival ever since.